Risk of Rain 2 is a roguelike third-person shooter that launched in early access on March 28, 2019 and has been met with overwhelming and outstanding positive reception. At the time of writing, the game sits at a 10 out of 10 on Steam. It is a sequel to the first Risk of Rain, which I feel I should clarify I have not played, but given the shift from 2D to 3D in the sequel, and from what I've heard about the first game, skipping it does not affect enjoyment of the second game. A factor that may influence enjoyment of the game is its multiplayer focus. While I have played the game with friends, I can say it's just as enjoyable to play solo, so it's simply a matter of preference. Gameplay in Risk of Rain 2 is incredibly simple on the surface. As of now, there are 7 playable characters, with more to be added in the future. These characters all possess distinctly different skills and abilities, which results in each class having a disparate playstyle from one another. While all these skills are set for each character, items themselves or where the amount of enjoyment you can have with these characters can vary. As a roguelike, at the start of each run, your character starts at level 1 with no items. Killing enemies awards the player with money, which they can spend at various interactable objects to acquire various items. Some of these, such as the terminals, will show the player exactly what they will receive. Others, such as the chests, might be color-coded, so you have an idea of what category of item you will receive, such as damage or healing. But for the vast majority of the run, items will be completely random. While items can be separated into basic broad categories such as damage or healing, their individual mechanics are what makes these items so fun to collect. For example, the Tri-Tip Dagger applies a bleed on targets with each attack. These bleed effects stack but eventually fade, so by playing aggressively and sustaining bleeds, enemies with high health can be killed in a matter of seconds. There are very few items in the game which are just straight number modifiers, which combined with a variety of items and their effects can lead to each run being a unique experience. The ultimate goal of each stage is to find the teleporter, acquiring items along the way to make your character more powerful so that when you do find the teleporter you can beat the boss that spawns and start the process again in the next stage. With each stage, stronger enemies will spawn and at a higher frequency. Eventually bosses from previous stages will join this relentless assault against the player as normal enemies in the stage. As of now, the game does not have a proper ending, so players are just meant to play until they are inevitably killed, which is admittedly pretty fun, if not just to see how ridiculous the game can sometimes get. So far, Risk of Rain 2 has received its first of 5 major updates laid out in the roadmap on the Steam page. The update added a new environment, which is, in my opinion, the most enjoyable stage, along with a new playable character. There were also a few new items and enemies added. Going off the roadmap, it looks as though all of the future updates will build upon similar features. However, I am normally skeptical of promises made regarding future content of games in early access, and I wouldn't buy them on the promise of said content. For the amount of content currently in the game, it feels worth its price tag. There really isn't much to spoil in this game, but if that brief summary sounds like something that might appeal to you, then I would strongly recommend the game for its $20 price tag. Keep in mind it is still in early access. It really was a very enjoyable experience going through this game with absolutely no prior knowledge and discovering everything on my own. That being said, if you're not yet convinced, and because this video would be very short if that's all I had to say, I'm going to discuss it in more detail now, along with some things I hope the devs will do in the future. Consider this your spoiler warning in massive quotation marks. Of the 7 playable characters currently in the game, I enjoy playing all of them but the most recent one. The first character players are given is the Commando. His set of abilities are very simple ranged attacks with a dodge roll. Having such a simple character at the start of the game really helps ease in the player and familiarize them with the rest of the game before ramping up the complexity of the skill sets with the other characters. That being said, the Commando does definitely suffer due to this simplicity, and in the earlier stages I find I can struggle with the bosses on occasion. That certainly doesn't mean he's a bad character, but I'm confident in saying the skill ceiling is pretty low with this guy. The Huntress is another fairly simple class I'd wager is the first one players unlock. Her primary attack homes in on targets and does not need to be aimed carefully. She can blink a surprisingly large distance, which makes her incredibly mobile, and her abilities put out some serious damage but have fairly long cooldowns compared to the other characters. Her low health does make her quite fragile, but she's still a lot of fun to play. Multi is one of my favorite characters to play. His abilities don't give him great vertical movement, so you'll have to depend on getting items to account for that. Personally, the damage he can dish out makes up for this. His special ability switches his primary weapon between 2 modes, a short-range rapid-firing nail gun and a single-shot highly accurate rebar puncher. Between these 2 modes, Multi is hands down the best equipped to deal with the variety of enemies the game throws at you. His utility gives him a nice speed boost and can deal a fair amount of damage on its own. The blast canister is a nice damage supplement for the rebar puncher, but using it in conjunction with the nail gun causes it to stop firing for a short time, limiting his short-range damage potential. The Engineer is pretty straightforward. Slap down some turrets and just let them do everything. If you've ever seen Meet the Engineer, that's exactly what it feels like.
Hey, look, bud. engineer.
The Artificer is my favorite class by far. She is a spellcaster who has no sort of evasive or defensive ability and is purely focused on damage with all of her abilities on short cooldowns. Due to the nature of her skill set, mobility items are recommended to increase her survivability, but nothing beats the constant stream of punishment the Artificer is capable of unleashing. The Mercenary is the only melee character in the game and definitely requires a bit of practice to use effectively. He can struggle a little with groups of flying enemies, but smart use of his abilities can make quick work of most enemies. With the right items and some practice, the Mercenary can pump out some very impressive damage. Finally, we have the character added in the most recent update, Rex. I personally really do not like using this character, despite the insane damage he is capable of dealing. I don't find the trade-off of taking damage to cast abilities a rewarding mechanic, and it frustrates me more than anything. I have no doubt there's a very high skill ceiling for Rex, but most of my runs with him end on the first stage like this. I don't have a lot to say about the stages in the game since they don't have much of an effect in the game. They all just serve as environments to collect items. They're not complex arenas or anything like that. For the most part, they do look quite nice given the game's sort of retro sci-fi aesthetic. The soundtrack definitely helps. That being said, given that they're set maps with maybe 1 or 2 changes between runs, they can get pretty repetitive. There are also patterns that once I noticed became one of my biggest gripes about the game. The first stage will always be one of 2 maps, and the 4th stage is always the same map. Thankfully, the Abyssal Depths is my favorite map visually and in terms of actual level design. The Wetlands aspect also get brownie points for its visual design, but I have the most trouble finding the teleporter on this map, which absolutely kills the pacing of the run, especially with the slower characters such as Rex or the Engineer. There's a lot more going on in the game than first impressions might have you believe. For example, discovering how some abilities can affect a character's movement, synergizing that with their items to get to hard to reach spots or just stay airborne in combat. It's a lot of fun to experiment with different item combinations, but due to the random nature of the game, you have to hit the jackpot to get those exact combinations. While the progression within runs is all well and good, as soon as the run inevitably ends, I'm always a little disappointed because once you've unlocked all the characters, there really isn't any progression outside of the runs. To compare to another roguelike, Wizard of Legend, progression outside of runs is a lot of fun and it feels like it gives the game a lot more replayability. There are outfits that give small passives and you can pick one item to begin the run with, which given how random the rest of Risk of Rain 2 is, I don't think incorporating a feature like this would be a bad idea. I am aware that artifacts are coming to the game soon, but from my understanding, they're just modifiers that affect the stage or the game more than the player. Throughout your run in the game, there is a small chance that a lunar coin will drop from enemies. These coins persist between runs and are so far the only items that behave this way. They can be spent at altars to unlock the hidden shop. Once in the hidden shop can be used to unlock the Artificer or buy lunar items. Lunar items are Risk of Rain 2's equivalent of cursed items, like providing double damage but having your health, or setting everything around you on fire, including you. Now, I'm sure there are very specific use cases for these kinds of items, and min-max players probably have a field day with these, but given the rarity of lunar coins and the fact they're the only persisting item outside of individual runs, it kind of feels like a fucking joke. I've never felt it was worth it to buy any of these items, and I would be much happier if there were a system in place to spend the coins to purchase rare items to have them available for future runs, because some of them are so much fun with certain characters. At the very least, I'd like some sort of shop with persistent purchases to spend lunar coins, since they're just collecting dust for me right now. Even some cosmetic items for each character would feel like a better use of the coins than the lunar items currently in the game. That being said, with future updates, I can only hope that with more lunar items being added, the wider variety will provide a few items that are worth spending and choices won't feel so limiting. This next point feels really nitpicky, but given the co-op nature of the game, I think it's fair to talk about. There is no way to drop items for other players, and all loot is shared, so hypothetically, one player can zoom around the map, take all the items for themselves, and handicap their team with no way to get any items whatsoever. I can see why there's no drop function, as it could be abused in conjunction with 3D printers to keep specific items and convert trash, but the unfortunate result is everyone scrambling around for whatever loot they can get their hands on. So that's a quick first impression of the early access build for Risk of Rain 2. Again, for $20 you're definitely getting plenty of bang for your buck, with lots of solid third person shooting and looting, but there's certainly room for improvement. I'll probably make a follow-up video for the full release, so if you didn't hate this video by some miracle and want to see that when it comes out, I'm sure you already know how subscribing works. Hopefully both the game and my videos will have improved by that point.